actually see what shock is driving it. But in the 19th century, it's very easy to see what's going on because you know exactly where the, well, you don't know exactly, but we have a pretty good idea of exactly where the shock is coming. So we say, fortunately, history provides a natural experiment to examine the effect of the impact of essentially an exogenous change in funding liquidity. So that's where the shock's going to be. It's going to be in funding liquidity. And we're going to see how that affects market liquidity and a bunch of other stuff, like stock returns. That's what we're trying to do. All right. So, back at, yeah, you can see I did a bad job on these slides. Too many words, I know. This is because I've never given this talk before. I have to make sure I keep everything in mind. So back in the 19th and early 20th centuries, you had a bunch of financial crises. There was one in 1819, 1857, 1873, 1890, and 1907. And if you go back and read the American Economic Review in 1911, Kemmerer will tell you that there's like a zillion other little panics. Mostly they occur in the fall. Not all of them occur in the fall. There are some spring panics, but mostly they occur in the fall. Now, why would that be? Well, back then, right now, about 3% of GDP is due to farming. We have more food now than ever before. People eat more than ever before. But yet, as a proportion of the economy, agriculture is not that big anymore. It's about 3% of the U.S. economy. Back in 1925, it was about 10%. Back in 1845, it was about 40%. So agriculture used to matter a lot. People even had jobs in agriculture. Maybe you've heard about them in children's songs like The Farmer in the Dell. There was this guy called the farmer, and the farmer would actually grow food. Now we have agribusiness that does that instead. I don't know if there's actually any real farmers left. Probably a few, but not as many as there were before. Anyway, so what happened back in the 19th century in agriculture? Well, it turned out we also had an arrangement in the 19th century which was especially bad for this particular problem. We were on the gold standard. So the amount of money that there was just some amount of money X, and there was no more, and you couldn't make any more. There was some amount of gold out there, and that gold, the amount of gold out there, that was the aggregate money supply, basically. That was all there was. You know, banks would issue notes based on the amount of gold they had in their vaults, and that's all they could do. They couldn't do any more. If more money was needed, it wasn't like the Fed, like it does now. The U.S. government couldn't just print more, couldn't just make up more. That was it. You were done. Until 1908, there was nothing that the Fed could do, particularly, because there was no Fed before 1908. In fact, before 1914, there wasn't, but in fact, there were other arrangements in that little interim period. So what would happen? So what would happen is every now and then, there would be like a turning point in financial markets. So maybe you were close to a business cycle peak, and asset price values had declined a little bit. So banks' balance sheets weren't in the greatest shape in the world because their asset values had gone down a little, which meant money was a little tight. They couldn't lend out so easily. There were reserve requirements then, like now, but they weren't very stringent, also like now. And what would happen? Well, maybe you'd have an unseasonably large shock in asset demand in the agricultural sector. So that could happen for a couple of reasons. One reason is that, say, if you're in the cotton markets, it's not like the farmers were withdrawing money to get their crops to market. Basically what they were doing was they were borrowing money. There was a shock to borrowing, and that shock would basically put pressure on banks to lend to them. What else is going on? Well, at the same time, there were also farmers who had other crops, and those guys, sometimes they actually did have money, and what they would do is they would withdraw it. So that has basically the same effect. In one case, you have a demand for more borrowing, which is going to raise interest rates. In the other case, you have a bunch of farmers withdrawing money from the system, and that's going to reduce the amount of assets that banks have available to lend, and it's going to create the same kind of effect. You're going to have interest rates in both cases could rise. And in fact, they could rise quite a lot, especially if there's nobody else there who's going to be able to stand in there and lend money. And in fact, between 1837, after Andrew Jackson did his hatchet jobs on the second bank in the United States and destroyed that institution, which turns out to be quite a useful institution, or at least we think so, for a lot of reasons, one of which is it sort of reduces stock market volatility. Until 1908, when the Aldrich-Vreeland Act passed, there was basically no way you'd have one of these shocks, and it's going to make, if the shock's big enough, interest rates are really going to spike. And that's the funding liquidity shock that we're talking about. So it's essentially an exogenous thing that comes from agriculture. It's not quite exogenous because, after all, asset values have probably fallen a little bit in the banks in the first place to make the banks more susceptible. Okay. So that's what we're going to. So we're going to exploit this seasonality to see if we can see whether having the Fed out there or any other lender of last resort, like even the Second Bank of the United States, which I have to admit I'm not exactly sure how it operated, except that it had such a conservative lending policy that it had funds to lend pretty much all the time. So if there were potentially an incipient crisis, then it could lend money. We don't know. We have a student who was actually entering the balance sheet data for the Second Bank of the United States as we speak, so we can find out whether they actually did that. But we're not there yet because this guy is slowly entering. And it's kind of a pain in the neck to get all that data together. So we're in the process of doing that. Okay, so we're going to look to see what the effect of these funding shocks are on market liquidity, market volatility, and stock returns. And you'll see we've only gotten so far. You'll see exactly how far we've gotten and what we need to do. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to look at interest rate volatility in the fall. We're going to compare that with the volatility of the rest of the year. Okay? And what we find, essentially in brief, is that the volatility is far higher in the fall when there's no lender of last resort. Now, we only go back to 1868 because that's all the data we have for the call loan interest rate, which it turns out is the interest rate that speculators used when they had to borrow for their margin accounts. Now, there's another rate that we can look at that goes back to about 1845. That's the commercial paper rate, and we're doing that. We're back to about 1870 now on the commercial paper rate. But we need to get back further because we want to see what actually happened in that free banking period, not just the national banking period. I don't know much about the free banking period right now. The national banking period, I know a lot about what's bad about that. Okay. Now, it turns out once you have the Federal Reserve in there, even before the Federal Reserve, when you had the Aldrich-Vreeland Act, which allowed a consortium of New York banks to do the lending for a short time, it turned out that there's no problem. You don't have excess volatility in the fall anymore. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah, one possibility is the New York clearinghouse existed from 1853 on and did exactly what we just described with the Aldrich-Vreeland Act. And so you had some ability of these banks to get together and try to deal with problems that were hitting one or two, and basically keep those operating if they were solvable.
In the
1853 on. 1907 was stress that system.
That's right. It wasn't. Yeah, so all I can tell you is it wasn't enough, because if you look at the volatility spikes during the entire national banking period, it's really been so. I know that there was some ability of banks to do that, but it looks like it wasn't as big as what the Aldrich-Vreeland allowed subsequently.
Compared to before 1853,
oh yes, see, that's a good point actually. But I don't know the answer because I don't really know how much data on the commercial paper rates. I think that goes back before 1853, but it only goes back maybe to 1845, so we don't have a lot of data there. But that's certainly worth looking at.
My student did a dissertation on the free banking era value of banknotes.
Oh, okay.
And there's really good data on that.
Oh, for banknotes.
So back to the 1830s.
I will look.
You may know more, so I'll give you his name later.
Oh, okay. That's very helpful. But it turns out that once you get after Aldrich-Vreeland, you're all set. Then it turns out that you can't. That volatility in the fall harvest season is actually lower a little bit than it is during the rest of the year. There's no problem there. Because that's the first thing we do. Now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to say, look, do these shocks affect stock return volatility? So we go very slowly. So the next thing we do is it turns out that before, like 2 years ago, you couldn't do this because the data before 1925 for stock returns was absolutely awful. It was this data that was the Coles data that went back. And what was wrong with the Coles data was you took the average, each monthly price was the average of the high and the low for the month. It's not very good data, and you get very high serial correlation of stock returns. And it turns out if you try to do the